All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Before we get into this assignment, just a few announcements. One, this is going to be the last video for this chapter, so your next assignment will be for test grade. Uh, Second thing, you're going to have instead of a final test, I'm sure you've been told this already, we're going to have a final project, and that's going to be posted, I believe Friday this week is when this officially gets posted. I'm doing this pretty early. It is currently May 12th. So we only recently found out that we're going to be doing these projects, from my point of view at least. So it should be all set and ready to go by the time this video drops. So we are going to go into a reading about Charles Darwin. And there's going to be an assignment. If you don't feel like listening to the dulcet sounds of my voice, you can turn this video off right now. And there are PDFs of the pages down below. All right, so let's get started. All right, Darwin presents his case. Before we begin with this reading, I want to take a look over here at the key concepts. I usually just skip this and explain it as we read, but some things I want to point out first. First off, how is natural variation used in artificial selection? These are some interesting word choices. Variation is a word I've been using. It means differences. Like you and your siblings may be different heights, or you and your friends could have different eye colors, different hair colors. These are variations. Artificial selection is something that we talked about, but I called it something else. I called it selective breeding. Like, we choose which dogs we want to breed in order to get the best puppies. Right? Charles Darwin referred to that as artificial selection. It's the same thing. How is natural selection related to a species' fitness? That has been the basis of my notes, so you should be acquainted with that. And what evidence of evolution did Darwin present? We've had notes on that. So this is going to be a good review for all of the notes. So this is a good study review. So let's get into the reading now. When Darwin returned to England in 1836, he brought back specimens from around the world. Subsequent findings about these specimens soon found the scientific community abuzz. Soon had the scientific community abuzz. Darwin learned that his Galapagos mockingbirds actually belonged to 3 separate species found nowhere else in the world. Even more surprising, the brown birds that Darwin had thought to be wrens, warblers, and blackbirds were all finches. They too were found nowhere else. The same was true for the Galapagos tortoises, the marine iguanas, and many plants that Darwin had collected from the islands. Each island species looked a great deal like a similar species in South American mainland, yet the island species were clearly different from the mainland species and from one another. Right? That's kind of the whole point right here, guys. They look similar to other species, but they're also different. They're one of a kind based on where they live. Okay, publication of On the Origin of Species. This is the name of his book. Darwin began filling notebooks with ideas about species diversity and the process that would later be called evolution. However, he did not rush out to publish his thoughts. A side note here is the idea of evolution did exist. He did not invent that. He coined the phrase for it, or someone did afterwards, but the idea was always there. His thing was how evolution happens. That's what he's talking about. Anyway, however, he did not rush out to publish his thoughts. Recall that Darwin's ideas challenged fundamental scientific beliefs of his day. Darwin was not only stunned by his discoveries, he was disturbed by them. Years later, he wrote, "It was evident that such facts as these could be explained on the supposition that species gradually became modified, and that the subject haunted me." Although he discussed his work with his friends, he shelved his manuscript for years and told his wife to publish it in case he died. So, yeah, the idea that animals were very slowly changing from generation to generation was such a weird thing to people back then, he was too afraid to publish it. He's like, yeah, publish it when I die. In 1858, Darwin received a short essay from Alfred Russel Wallace, a fellow naturalist who had been doing field work in Malaysia. That essay summarized the thoughts on evolutionary change that Darwin had been mulling over for almost 25 years. Suddenly, Darwin had an incentive to publish his own work. At the scientific meeting later that year, Wallace's essay had presented together with some of Darwin's work. Remember, guys, in science, publish or perish. If you're not the first one to get your information out there, you will not be the one remembered. So he had to get published, even though he was afraid to. Darwin began writing in earnest. 18 months later, in 1859, he published the results of his work on the origin of species. In his book, he proposed a mechanism for the evolution that he called natural selection. He then presented evidence demonstrating that the process of evolution has been taking place for millions of years and continues in all living things. Darwin's work caused an immediate sensation. Many people considered his arguments to be brilliant, while others strongly opposed and even ridiculed his message. But what did Darwin actually say? Natural variation and artificial selection. Darwin began his explanation of evolution by abandoning the ideas of a species as perfect and unchanging. That's what people actually believe, guys. People believe that organisms sprung into existence already perfect and therefore will never change. This is how they are, deal with it. He argued this. He argued that natural variation, defined as differences among individuals of a species, is found in all types of organisms. Variation is present in a species in nature, as shown in figure 15-9, and in farm crops and livestock. So, where's 15? Yeah, just -10. Back page. Here we go. 15-9. Each zebra inherits genes that give it distinctive patterns or stripes. Those visibly different patterns are an example of natural variation. Each zebra, if you look closely, has a different stripe pattern, almost like fingerprints. Some cows gave more milk than others, for example, and some plants bore larger fruit than others. Darwin proposed that much of his variation could be inherited or passed on to the next generation. Today, the fact that variation exists seems obvious. We can easily observe it in so many living things. In Darwin's day, however, it was a revolutionary to suggest that variation was a major feature in life. Despite all his world travels, Darwin actually made some of his greatest progress on evolutionary theory by studying the work of English farmers and breeders. He noted that breeders routinely use variation to improve their crops and livestock. Through a technique called selective breeding, they would determine which individuals to use for breeding based on natural variation that they found. Only the largest hogs and the fastest horses or the cows that gave the most milk were selected to produce offspring. Right? So they chose what they considered to be the best and bred those animals, hoping to get a better next generation. Darwin termed this process artificial selection. Using artificial selection, breeders were able to produce a wide range of plants and animals that looked very different from their ancestors. So here's one of our key concepts from the beginning. In artificial selection, nature provided the variation among different organisms, and humans selected those variations they found useful. Artificial selection is still used today to shape the variety of traits as shown in figure 15-10. So this is an original species, and humans kept breeding for different reasons. They took the ones that had the best flowers on top and only bred them, and we ended up getting cauliflower. Other people took just this plants that had the best stems and kept breeding them to eventually get broccoli. Some other people bred to make Brussels sprouts. Some other people bred to make kale. And some people breaded to make something that I've never heard of called kohlrabi. Good to know. But they all stemmed from one original plant. Evolution by natural selection. This is what our notes were based on. Darwin's next insight was to compare processes in nature to artificial selection. By doing so, he developed a scientific hypothesis to explain how evolution occurs. This is where Darwin made his greatest contribution and his strongest break with the past. The struggle for existence. Darwin was convinced that a process like artificial selection worked in nature. But how? He recalled Malthus's work on population growth. Darwin realized that high birth rates and a shortage of life's basic needs would eventually force organisms into a competition for resources. You guys have probably experienced that right now with food stores not being well stocked. We are all now competing to get the best groceries, all right, to get to the toilet paper first. Whoever has the best traits for getting those resources are the best for this environment. The ones who can't keep up are going to starve or going to have to take a shower after every time they go to the bathroom. Gross. And that's what happens in nature too. The struggle for existence means that members of each species compete regularly to obtain food, living space, and other necessities of life. In this struggle, the predators that are faster or have a particular way of ensnaring other organisms can catch more prey. Those prey that are faster, better camouflaged, better protected, such as the porcupine shown in 15-11 down here, this guy, can avoid being caught. This struggle for existence was central to Darwin's theory of evolution. Survival of the fittest. A key factor in the struggle for existence, Darwin observed, sorry, I'm going to try it again. A key factor in the struggle for existence, Darwin observed, was how well suited an organism is to its environment. Darwin called the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in its specific environment fitness. All right? I left a video earlier where I simply said fitness was being able to have kids. That's what that means. The ability for an individual to survive and reproduce in its environment. That's what fitness is. Darwin proposed that fitness is the result of adaptations. An adaptation is an inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. Right? People think adaptation means to change. Right? That's adapt. An adaptation is something that you are born with. And whoever has the best version of that adaptation is going to survive the best. So whichever porcupine has the best quills is going to protect itself better. Successful adaptations, Darwin concluded, enabled organisms to become better suited to their environment and thus better able to survive and reproduce. Adaptations can be physical characteristics, such as a porcupine's sharp quills, or more complex features, such as behavior, in which some animals live and hunt in groups. For example, there is actually an adaptation of intelligence. There is a species of dolphins, I forget the name of the island, but they've learned to hang out by an island and they hunt when humans go fishing. And the dolphins and the humans have learned to work together. The dolphins all circle around the fish and bring them closer to the island, and the humans start catching the fish with the nets, which scares the fish right back to the dolphins. So now we help each other out. That is a behavioral adaptation. And the ability to learn that kind of thing is something that you can pass on. You can't genetically pass on knowledge, but you can genetically pass on the ability to learn. The concept of fitness, Darwin argued, was central to the process of evolution by natural selection. Generation after generation, individuals compete to survive and produce offspring. Baby birds in 15-12, for example, compete for food and space while in the nest. Because each individual differs from and other members of a species, each has unique advantages and disadvantages. Individuals with characteristics that are not well suited to their environment, that is, with low levels of fitness, either die or leave few offspring. Individuals that are better suited for their environment, that is, higher levels of fitness, survive and reproduce most successfully. This was a process that Darwin called survival of the fittest. Whoever has the most ability to reproduce will pass on more genes, and the next generation will have more of that trait. Because of its similarities to artificial selection, Darwin referred to survival of the fittest as natural selection. In both artificial selection and natural selection, only certain individuals of a population produce new individuals. However, in natural selection, the traits being selected, and therefore increasing over time, contribute to an organism's fitness in its environment. Wherein artificial selection, farmers chose; in natural selection, it's based on who can survive. That's where I was. Here we go. Natural selection also takes place without human control or direction. Key concept here: over time, natural selection results in changes in the inherited characteristics of a population. These changes increase the species' fitness in its environment. Natural selection cannot be seen directly. It can only be observed as changes in a population over many successful generations. I believe at this point that I am recording this, or by the time you watch this, you would have already done my breeding bunny lab. Right? That's what you have seen. 10 generations, and over generation after generation, you saw changes in the allele frequency. You started off with a pretty even number of alleles, and then after 10 generations, you saw a lot more of one than the other. I think you end up seeing a lot more dominance than recessiveness. So that was a change. Right. Next section, descent with modification. Darwin proposed that over long periods, natural selection produces organisms that have different structures, establish different niches, or occupy different habitats. As a result, species today look different from their ancestors. Each living species has descended with changes from other species over time. He referred to this principle as descent with modification. Descent with modification also implies something else, that all living organisms are related to one another. Look back in time and you will find a common ancestor shared by tigers, panthers, and cheetahs. Look farther back in time and you will find ancestors that these felines share with horses, dogs, bats, and primates. Farther back still are common ancestors of mammals, birds, alligators, and fishes. If we look far enough back, logic concludes we could find the common ancestor of all living things. This is the principle known as common descent. According to this principle, all species, living and extinct, were derived from common ancestors. We are related to an original species. Carry the concepts of descent with modification and common descent to the logical conclusion, and what did they produce? A single tree of life that links all living things on Earth. A family tree of every single species, all on the same tree. Darwin conceived of this idea long before he published his theory of evolution. Okay, evidence of evolution. With this unified dynamic theory of life, Darwin could finally explain many of the observations he had made during his travels aboard the Beagle. He presented these observations as evidence of the process of evolution. Darwin argued that living things had been evolving on Earth for millions of years. Evidence for this process could be found in the fossil record, the geographical distribution of living species, homologous structures of living organisms, and similarities in early development. So let's break those down. Fossil record. It is well known in Darwin's time that fossils were the remains of ancient life, and that different layers of rock have been formed at different times in Earth's history. Meaning, if you see a whole bunch of like stripes on the side of a mountain, like go to the Grand Canyon and see different color stripes, each stripe is a different geologic time. Wow, I cannot talk right now. Try it again. Each stripe is a different geologic time. All right. However, few people view the fossil record as Darwin did, as a detailed record of evolution. Darwin proposed that Earth was hundreds of millions rather than thousands of years old. During this time, he stated countless species of many different forms had appeared on Earth, lived for a time, and then vanished. Fossils that have formed in different layers of rock were evidence of a gradual change over time. In fact, by examining fossils from sequential layers of rock, one could view how a species had changed and produced different species over time, as shown in figure 15-3. That's dash 13, dash 14. Here we go. 15-13. Darwin argued that the fossil record provide evidence that living things have been evolving for millions of years. Sometimes the fossil record includes similar intermediate forms of a group of organisms that together suggest gradual modification over time. The four organisms shown here are all cephalopods, a group that includes octopi and squid. Fossil evidence indicates that these organisms gradually evolved into longer, more coiled shells. So, kind of rounded shell, very long, pointy shell, and then it starts twisting, and then this one's very, very twisted. That change happened over a very, very long time. Geographic distribution of living species. Remember that many parts of the biological puzzle that Darwin saw in his Beagle voyage involved living organisms. After Darwin discovered that those little brown birds he collected in the Galapagos were all finches, he began to wonder how they came to be similar yet distinctly different from one another. Each species was slightly different from every other species. They were also slightly different from the most similar species on the mainland of South America. Could the island birds have changed over time as the population in different places adapted different local environments? Darwin struggled with this question for a long time. He finally decided that all of these birds could have descended with modification from a common mainland ancestor, meaning some bird from South America ended up spreading across those islands, and because each island was a little bit different, they had different needs, and then each island passed on different traits based on those needs. So after generation, the birds on different islands ended up looking different than each other. There were other parts of the living puzzle as well. Recall that Darwin found entirely different species of animals on the continents of South America and Australia. Yet, when he looked at similar environments on those continents, he sometimes saw different animals that had similar structures and behaviors. Darwin's theory of descent with modification made scientific sense of this part of the puzzle as well. Species now living on different continents, shown in figure 15-14, the beaver in North America, muskrat as well, capybara and coypu in South America, look kind of similar with similar traits, even though they're in different lands. Had each descended from different ancestors. However, that's right, guys, they look similar, but they do not have a similar enough ancestor. However, because some animals on each continent were living under similar ecological conditions, they were exposed to similar pressures of natural selection, meaning they had the same needs. They lived the same way and had the same needs, so they ended up passing on those similar traits. Because these similar selective pressures, different animals ended up evolving certain striking features in common. All right. So even though these four animals come from different backgrounds, they live in similar enough areas that they have the same needs and ended up growing to look almost the same, or at least similar enough. Homologous body structures. Further evidence of evolution can be found in living animals. By Darwin's time, research had noticed striking similarities among the body parts of animals with backbones. For example, they described the similarities among the bones of different vertebrates, such as reptiles, birds, and mammals. Some of these limbs are arms, whereas others are wings, legs, or even flippers. The limbs differ greatly in form and function, yet they are all constructed from the same basic bones shown in figure 15-15. Right up here, check this out. Turtle, alligator, bird, mammal, and some primitive fish. Similar bone structures here. Humerus, radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Notice that if you don't know those bone names, look at the colors. Yellow, purple, yellow, red, blue. 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 It's the same bone patterns, just shaped slightly different. They have the actual same structures. What is the scientific explanation for these similarities? Each of these limbs has adapted in ways that enable organisms to survive in different environments. Despite these different functions, however, these limb bones all develop from the same clumps of cells in growing embryos. Structures such as these, which have different mature forms but develop from the same embryonic tissue, are called homologous structures. Homologous structures provide strong evidence that all four-limbed animals with backbones have descended with modification from common ancestors. Right? Even though they all live differently, this guy lives on land, this guy lives out in the sky, this one is back and forth, and so is this one. And they live different ways, but they all got the same bones because they probably have a shared ancestor who originally had those bones. There's still more information to be gathered from homologous structures. If we compare the front limbs, which we can see all bird wings are more similar to one another than any other of them are to a bat wings. If we compare the front limbs, we can see that all bird wings are more similar to one another than any of them are to bat wings. Meaning all birds are more closely related to each other than they are to bats. Other bones in bird skeletons most closely resemble the homologous bones of certain reptiles, including crocodiles and extinct reptiles such as dinosaurs. Little incorrect information there, dinosaurs are not technically reptiles. Dinosaurs were their own thing. So ignore that. The bones that support the wings of bats, by contrast, are more similar to the front limbs of humans, whales, and other mammals than they are to those of birds. These similarities and differences help biologists group animals according to how recently they last shared a common ancestor. Not all homologous structures serve important functions. The organs of many animals are so reduced in size that they are just vestiges or traces of homologous organisms in other species. These vestigial organs, shown in 15-16, may resemble miniature legs, tails, or other structures. So take a look here. These three animals are skinks, a type of lizard. In some species of skinks, legs have become vestigial. They are so reduced that they no longer function in walking. In humans, the appendix is an example of a vestigial organ because it carries no function in digestion. So these legs in these skinks really don't do anything. They have them, but they're not using them. So where were we? Why would organisms possess organs with little to no function? One possibility is that the presence of a vestigial organ may not affect an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. In that case, natural selection would not cause the elimination of that organ. I mean, if something was bad, it would prevent you from reproducing, you would not spread the gene. These are not bad. They're not good either. They're neutral. They don't do anything. Right? So they're not stopping them from reproducing. So they can still pass on those genes and the next generation still has them. Similarities in early development. The early stages or embryos of many animals with backbones are so similar that they can be hard to tell apart. This does not mean that a human embryo is ever identical to a fish or a bird embryo. However, as you can see in figure 15-17, many embryos look especially similar during early stages of development. What do these similarities mean? So here's 15-17. We have a chicken, we have a turtle, and we have a rat. So you can see a chicken and a turtle are extremely similar, and a rat is a little similar, but not as similar. The idea is they have a common ancestry. They have some common ancestor, and the chicken and the turtle have a more common ancestor. There have in the past been incorrect explanations for these similarities. Also, the great biologist Ernest Haeckel fudged some of his drawings to make the earliest stages of some embryos seem more similar than they actually are. Errors aside, however, it is clear that the same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce the tissues and organs of all vertebrates. These common cells and tissues growing in similar ways produce the homologous structures discussed earlier. So these guys all have similar cell structure in the similar locations on their bodies, so they end up growing in similar ways. All right, last page, summary. Darwin's theory of evolution presented a new view of life, summarized below. This view, profoundly different from anything known in 19th century England, continues to be upheld by research today. Many would still agree with Darwin, who wrote, "There is grandeur in this view of life, that from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and wonderful have been and are being evolved." So let's do this summary, 1 to 8. 1, individual organisms in nature differ from one another. Some of this variation is inherited. 2, organisms in nature produce more offspring than can survive, and many of those that survive do not reproduce. 3, because more organisms are produced than can survive, members of these species must compete for limited resources. 4, because each organism is unique, each has a different advantage and disadvantage in the struggle for existence. 5, individuals best suited to their environment survive and reproduce most successfully. The characteristics that make them best suited for their environment are passed on to the offspring. Individuals whose characteristics are not as well suited to their environment die or leave fewer offspring. Species change over time. Sorry, this is 6. Species change over time. Over long periods, natural selection causes changes in the characteristics of a species, such as in size and form. New species arise and other species disappear. 7, species alive today have descended with modifications from species that lived in the past. And 8, all organisms on Earth are united into a single tree of life by common descent. Whew. That was a lot. But not done yet. If you go back to Google Classroom, you will find a Google form waiting for you based on this worksheet. It won't look exactly like this. I'm going to modify it so that it fits in a Google form. but it is there waiting for you. Good luck.